one must look at the shared but contested heritage of Ukraine and Russia. Both Russia and Ukraine claim that their heritage starts from Kievan Rus, the small Rus, a 9th century empire that united most of the Eastern Slavic and Finnic tribes and adopted Byzantine Orthodoxy in the 9th to 11th centuries. The two countries' shared heritage goes back to more than 1,000 years, to the time of Kiev, when Ukrainian capital was the center of the first Slavic state, Kievan Rus, the birthplace of both Ukraine and Russia. In AD 988, Vladimir I, the pagan prince of Novgorod and Grand Prince of Kiev, accepted the Orthodox Christian faith and was baptized in the Crimean city of Chersonesus. From that moment onward, as the Russian leader Vladimir Putin insists and recently declared, Russians and Ukrainians are one people, a single whole, they can't be divided. Ukrainians have obviously a different view of this. After the Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, the histories of people inhabiting the territories of Russia and Ukraine diverged. The Grand Duchy of Moscow united all remnants of Rus northern provinces that evolved in course of time into the Russian state. But over the past 10 centuries, Ukraine has repeatedly been carved up by invading competing powers. The Mongol invaders came from the east, Polish and Lithuanian armies from the west, and attacked and occupied parts of Ukraine. During the period of Imperial Russian expansion, ever since 1793, Ukraine was annexed to the Tsarist Empire and colonized. Ukrainians have bitter memories of this period of Tsarist colonization, but probably the most bitter memories date back to Ukraine, when Ukraine fell under the communist rule. Ukraine suffered some of its greatest traumas during the 20th century. After the Communist Revolution of 1917, Ukraine was one of the many countries to fight a brutal civil war before being fully absorbed into Soviet Union in 1922. In the early 1930s, to force the peasants in Ukraine to join collective farming, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin orchestrated a famine, a man-made famine that resulted in starvation and deaths of millions of Ukrainians. And afterward, the Stalin imported a large number of Russians and other Soviet citizens and settled them, many with no ability to speak Ukrainian, with few ties to the region, to help repopulate the East. Now, this repopulation of the East during the 1930s may be taken as when the partition of Ukraine, the seeds of partition of Ukraine were sown, because Eastern Ukraine came under Russian rule much earlier than the Western Ukraine. People in the East have stronger ties to Russia. So some believe, till the Russians invaded, when the Russians may have lost their goodwill even in this territory and have been more likely to support Russian-leaning leaders. Western Ukraine, by contrast, spent centuries under shifting controls of European powers. Now, one quick look at Ukraine after the collapse of the USSR. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine became an independent nation. But uniting the country remained a difficult task. Western Ukraine, in contrast to the East, spent centuries under shifting controls of European power, had a mindset which was closer to Eastern Europe than the Eastern Ukraine, which was more or less an extension of the westernmost part of Russia. The Eastern population tended to be Russian-speaking, Orthodox, and different from the Ukrainian-speaking people who were Catholic. The transition to democracy and capitalism in Ukraine was painful and chaotic, and many Ukrainians at times, especially in the East, longed for the relative stability of the communist era. The famines were forgotten, the exploitation was forgotten, the security and stability which the Stalinist regime has brought was kept in mind. The relations between the successor states have remained disturbed ever since. After the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the newly independent republics of Ukraine and Russia on surface retained cordial ties, but simmering discontent was there. Ukraine agreed in 1994 to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and to dismantle the nuclear arsenal which the USSR had left behind in Ukraine. Some believe that this was a major mistake. Had Ukraine been a owner or in control of these nuclear weapons, it probably would not be as easily bullied by the Russians subsequently. In return, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States agreed in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 to uphold and maintain the territorial integrity of Ukraine. At that moment of time, Ukrainians felt that this guarantee was enough. In 1999, Russia signed the Charter for European Security, which reaffirmed the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose or change its security arrangements, including the treaties or alliances. Now, remember in 1999, Russia was in a very bad state. It was almost on the precipice of anarchy. It was practically bankrupt. There were oligarchs which were in power, which were behaving like warlords. And it seemed that the disintegration of the Russian state, its implosion, was going to be there very soon. This is when Putin had taken over for the first time as the president in 1999. But when Yeltsin was in power, who nominated Putin as his successor, handpicked him, at that stage, Russians were not in a position to assert themselves, either their control on their East European satellite countries or constituent units of the erstwhile Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. So Ukrainians thought that when Russia was weak, these guarantees given in the Budapest Declaration and in the Minsk Agreement will be enough for them. The relations between the successor states are interesting. After the Soviet Union collapsed, several former East Bloc countries joined NATO, partly due to regional security threats such as the 1993 Russian constitutional crisis, the war in Abkhazia, and the First Chechen War, 94-96. They wanted to escape this state of anarchy from erstwhile Soviet Union, present-day Russia, then to spill over into their territories. So they opted for different alliances, which of course the Russians had agreed in 1999. The Russian leaders claimed that Western powers had pledged that NATO would not extend eastward, although this remains disputed. At the 2008 Bucharest summit, Ukraine and Georgia sought to join NATO. The response among the existing members was divided, with some European members concerned about antagonizing Russia. Remember that this was the time when the West was thinking that the weak Russia would try to integrate with European world, a Western world economic system. It would try to join the process of globalization, and this economic liberalization in course of time would lead to political liberalism. It would lead to democratization of the Russian polity. This did not happen, but till in 2008, the hope very much existed. And Putin, let's not forget, had been in power just for 2 terms, and he was about to make place for Medvedev, his nominee as the president, when he would receive back as a prime minister. NATO ultimately refused to offer Ukraine and Georgia membership, but also issued a statement agreeing that these countries will become members of NATO subsequently. Vladimir Putin voiced strong opposition to the NATO membership bids, and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Russia would do everything in its power to prevent the admittance of these countries, because the Russian concerns seem to be pretty legitimate. NATO had not been dismantled after the end of the Cold War, while the Warsaw Pact had been dismantled. The disintegration and dissolution of the Soviet Union had weakened. There was no communist bloc to contend with, and there was perhaps no need, no justification for NATO to continue as a military alliance system to check, block, resist Russia. So the Russian demand was that NATO should also be dismantled like the Warsaw Pact. This did not happen. Relations with Russia went sharply downhill after the Euromaidan protests. After the 2014 revolution, the pro-Russian counter-revolutionary protests erupted in southern and eastern Ukraine. This was followed by annexation of Crimea. Russians were very apprehensive that if they allowed things to continue like this, Crimea might fall outside their grasp at all. And the armed pro-Russian separatists seized control of the government buildings and proclaimed that the states of Donetsk and Luhansk are independent, sparking the Donbass war. Now, this was how Russia was raising the ante. The eastern Ukraine was becoming a disturbed area, tempted constantly by the Russia to join them. Crimea had been, for all practical purposes, annexed. Ukrainian government was constrained to recognize the Azov battalion, which had long acted as an independent militia with a fascist, often anti-Semitic ideology, but they were fighting against the Russian influence in the eastern Ukraine, and this prompted Putin to tarnish Zelensky's image and his regime as supportive of a Nazi ideology. Here, two things are worth noting. When Russia annexed Crimea, the rest of the world did nothing else. The Western power treated it as a fait accompli and conceded, so to speak, that Russia was not doing something which was illegitimate, although it was a gross violation of international relations, but it was taken as a fait accompli. And this is what probably encouraged Putin subsequently.